The first time I packed up for a solo backcountry trip, I was proud of myself. I'd watched every video, read every blog, and memorised the 10 essentials. But nothing, I learned, replaces real miles under your boots. I started that morning under a bright blue sky, my pack a little heavier than it should have been, my confidence even heavier. The plan was simple: hike 6 miles to a lake, camp for the night, and hike back out the next day. Easy. At least, that's what I thought. By mid-afternoon, the sun was a punishing disk above the pines, and the trail had grown faint, twisting through patches of scrub oak and granite outcrops. My water bottle was lighter than I liked, but the map showed a creek not far ahead. I pushed on, hearing only my own boots crunching the dust and the occasional call of a jay. When I reached where the creek was supposed to be, it was nothing but cracked earth and dry reeds. That's when my stomach tightened. I still had a few sips left, but not much else. I sat down on a rock to check my bearings. The map in my trembling hands didn't match the world around me. I'd drifted. Somewhere between the switchbacks and the ridgeline, I'd missed a turn. My mouth was already dry, and a low hum of worry started in my chest. I tried to convince myself I wasn't really lost, just temporarily misplaced. But the truth of it crept in, the way the shadows were creeping across the trail. That's when I saw movement through the trees, a figure stepping out from the sunlit haze. An older man, lean and steady, with a wide-brimmed hat and a faded pack that had seen more miles than I could imagine. He gave me a slow nod as if he'd been expecting me. "Running a bit low, are you?" he asked, his voice rough but calm. I admitted I was, embarrassed at how unprepared I suddenly felt. He smiled slightly and handed me his canteen. "Sip, don't gulp," he said. "And tell me how you ended up here." I told him everything, my route, my plan, how I'd followed what I thought was the right trail. He studied the map, then pointed his walking stick toward a ridge. "You're about a mile off. Happens to everyone once. The trick," he said, looking me in the eye, "is making sure it doesn't happen twice." We walked together after that, his pace slow but sure, his eyes scanning the land like he could read it the way others read a newspaper. I asked if he was out camping too. He chuckled softly. "Been out here a few days. I like to check on folks who wander off the trail." That sounded strange, but I didn't question it. There was something about him, steady, quiet, like part of the landscape itself. As we neared the ridge, he stopped and crouched beside a patch of cattails, half hidden in the shadows. "There's your water," he said. I hadn't even noticed the narrow trickle of a spring running through the rocks. He showed me how to collect it safely, filtering and boiling, explaining the signs that point to clean sources. His words were simple, but each one carried the weight of experience. That night, I made camp near the lake, just as planned. I offered to share my dinner, but he only smiled and said he'd be moving on. I watched him fade into the trees, his lantern bobbing like a firefly until it disappeared completely. I never saw him again, but when I retraced my route home the next morning, I noticed there were no fresh boot prints on the trail besides my own. The next morning, the forest felt different, sharper somehow, every sound more alive. I woke to the smell of damp earth and pine needles, the sky just beginning to lighten above the lake. My legs were stiff from the miles, and my mind still buzzed with the memory of the man who'd guided me back. I half wondered if I'd dreamed him up, a mirage conjured from thirst and worry. But when I reached for my pot, I saw the faint scrape marks near the spring where he'd shown me how to collect water. That settled it. He'd been real. As I brewed a small cup of instant coffee, I thought about what he'd said. The trick is making sure it doesn't happen twice. Those words carried more weight than I'd realized at the time. It wasn't just about losing a trail. It was about humility. The quiet, necessary kind that keeps you alive out here. I'd thought preparation meant having all the right gear and a solid plan. But out here, preparation meant paying attention, listening, reading the wind, the slope of the land, the feel of the air. I hadn't done any of that yesterday. I'd just followed the line on a map. After breakfast, I packed up camp with deliberate care, stowing each item where it belonged, checking and rechecking my bearings. The lake was still and silver, reflecting the sky like a mirror. A heron lifted off from the far bank, its wings slicing through the mist. I took that as a good sign. The day ahead was long, but I felt calmer now, like I'd been handed a compass that pointed not just north, but towards something steadier inside me. By mid-morning, I was hiking again, moving along the trail with a new rhythm. Every few hundred yards, I'd pause and look back, tracing landmarks, making mental notes the way the old hiker had taught me. A fallen cedar, a patch of moss on a boulder, the faint bend in a creek bed. Little markers that told a story of where I'd been and where I was going. The air was cool at first, then slowly warmed with the rising sun. Cicadas started their lazy chorus, and the forest came alive. Around noon, I stopped for lunch beneath a stand of aspens. Their leaves whispered overhead, a language that sounded almost like laughter. As I chewed my last bite of jerky, I heard footsteps behind me, soft, deliberate. My heart skipped. When I turned, there he was again. The same hiker, hat pulled low, eyes steady. "You're keeping a better pace today," he said with that half smile of his. "Learning the rhythm." I asked where he'd camped, but he only shrugged. "A bit that way," he said, gesturing vaguely with his stick. "Doesn't matter much. The woods have room for everyone who respects them." Then he crouched beside me and pointed to the sky, where a few clouds were forming to the west. "Those will build before evening. If you want to make it out dry, you'll need to move with the shadows." So we walked together again, me trying to keep up, him pointing out things I'd never have noticed on my own. The faint trace of deer tracks crossing the trail, a tuft of fur caught in the bark of a spruce, the way the air cooled slightly as we climbed toward higher ground. "The land tells you what it's doing," he said. "You just have to listen." When the first low rumble of thunder echoed through the valley, he stopped and looked toward the clouds. "Best find cover before that gets serious." He led me to a cluster of boulders tucked beneath a ridge, their overhang forming a natural shelter. We waited there as the rain began, heavy and relentless, pounding the earth until it turned to the smell of wet stone and pine resin. I remember thinking how strange it felt, sharing silence with a man I barely knew, yet feeling safer than I had since the moment I stepped off the trail. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, I listened to his quiet breathing and the slow, steady rhythm of the rain, like an old song teaching me its tune. The storm broke just before dusk, leaving the world washed clean and shimmering. Mist rose from the trees, and the setting sun filtered through it in long golden beams. For a while, neither of us spoke. We just watched the rain drip from the rocks, and the last rolls of thunder fade into the distance. When I finally turned to thank him, the man was packing his gear with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. His hands moved with the kind of calm that only comes from years of trusting the wilderness, and being trusted by it in return. I asked how long he'd been out here. He smiled a little at that, tying the flap of his old canvas pack. "Long enough to know the forest gives you what you need, not what you want," he said. "And long enough to know that getting lost isn't always a bad thing. Then he picked up a handful of damp pine needles and scattered them over the spot where the fire had been, erasing any trace of our stay. "Leave it as though you were never here," he added. That's the second rule. As we started down the trail, the air smelled of sap and ozone, sharp and alive. My boots squelched in the mud, but I didn't mind. I was noticing everything now. The tilt of the ridgeline, the bird calls shifting as evening deepened, even the faint animal tracks pressed into the wet earth. I felt like the forest had opened its eyes to me for the first time. The man walked ahead, his stick tapping softly against the stones, his stride unhurried but purposeful. We stopped at a fork in the trail I hadn't even seen on my map. The left path dipped into a hollow thick with shadow. The right climbed toward open country, where the light still lingered on the peaks. He pointed toward the latter. "That'll take you back toward the trailhead," he said. "You've got maybe 3 miles before nightfall." Then he turned his gaze toward the darker path. "I'll be heading this way." "Wait," I said, suddenly reluctant to part ways. "Can I ask, how do you know all this? The land, the trails, the weather?" He chuckled, the sound low and warm. "You pay attention long enough, the land starts talking back." He tapped his temple, but only if you listen more than you speak. There was something about him I couldn't quite place. Something timeless, like he'd walked these woods for generations. I reached out to shake his hand, but he only nodded, tipping the brim of his hat. "Keep your eyes open, and don't just walk through the forest. Walk with it." I watched him disappear down the shadowed trail, his figure swallowed by the trees. I stood there a while, feeling the damp wind brush past, carrying the scent of pine and earth and the faintest trace of wood smoke. Then I turned toward the ridge, following the lighter path. The climb was steep and my legs burned, but the rhythm of my steps felt steady now, almost sure. Every so often, I thought I heard a stick tap behind me, or a voice just at the edge of hearing. But when I looked back, the trail was empty. The forest had gone still again, as though it were holding its breath. When I finally reached the crest, the view opened wide. Valleys painted in fog, the last sunlight spilling over distant hills. For the first time that trip, I didn't feel small or scared or lost. I felt part of it all. The wind, the soil, the endless rhythm of growing and fading and beginning again. I set up camp beneath a grove of spruce that night, using what I'd learned from watching him. The way to anchor the tarp tight against the wind, how to build a small, smokeless fire that wouldn't leave a scar. The air was cool, carrying the smell of wet bark and wood smoke. I sat beside the fire until the stars came out, remembering his words. The trick is making sure it doesn't happen twice. Somewhere deep in the forest, a night bird called, long and low, and I thought maybe, just maybe, the old hiker was still out there, listening too. When dawn came, it slipped quietly through the spruce boughs, pale and silver like breath on glass. I woke to that stillness that only exists between night and morning, when even the birds haven't yet decided to start their day. The coals from my fire glowed faintly, and the smell of smoke lingered on my jacket. For a long while, I just sat there with my tin mug, watching steam rise from the coffee and vanish into the air. The world felt new again, washed clean by the storm and silence. It struck me, sitting there, how different I felt from the person who'd first stepped onto that trail. I'd started out treating the wilderness like something to conquer, another list to check off, another challenge to beat. But now, I saw it as something alive, older and wiser than any of us. It didn't need conquering. It needed respect. I could almost hear that old hiker's voice reminding me, the woods have room for everyone who respects them. Those words sat deep, like a stone in the centre of a calm pond. After breakfast, I began the final leg of my hike out. The path wound down through stands of fir and aspen, sunlight flickering like candlelight between the branches. The air smelled sweet, sap, damp leaves, and the faint tang of wet granite. I found myself moving slower than I needed to. Not because I was tired, but because I didn't want the trail to end. Each step felt like a farewell to something I was only just beginning to understand. I paused beside a fallen tree that crossed a narrow creek. Its bark was slick from the rain, and on the far side I noticed something. Faint prints in the mud. Boot prints. Deep, deliberate, and spaced with the same steady rhythm I'd heard from his walking stick. I knelt down, tracing the edge of one with my finger. They led upstream, away from the main trail, disappearing into the brush. I couldn't explain it, but I smiled. He'd passed this way not long before me. Somehow, that thought filled me with quiet reassurance. By midday, I reached the familiar signpost marking the start of the main route back to the trailhead. It felt strange to see something man-made again. Carved letters, bolts in wood, a bit of faded orange paint. Civilization was only a few miles ahead, but I lingered a while, listening to the wind move through the branches. I pulled out my map, the same one I'd clutched with such uncertainty days before. Now, the contours and lines made sense. They weren't just symbols, but memories. Each ridge and hollow a chapter in a story I'd lived. A family of hikers passed me going in, bright packs and cheerful chatter breaking the stillness. They asked if the lake ahead was worth the trip. I told them it was, and added, "Stay on the right fork past the ridge. It's easy to drift left." The father nodded, grateful, and I realised I sounded a little like him now, the mysterious hiker who'd appeared just when I'd needed help. I made it back to the trailhead in the late afternoon. My car sat alone in the gravel lot, a fine layer of dust coating the windshield. As I dropped my pack and leaned against the door, a faint breeze rustled through the trees behind me. And for an instant, I thought I saw him again. A figure in a wide-brimmed hat moving along the tree line. But when I blinked, there was nothing. Only the quiet whisper of the forest. Driving home, I couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't just shown me how to find my way back to the trail, but how to find something else. Something quieter and steadier within myself. The road wound through miles of green hills, and though I was leaving the backcountry behind, I knew it would never really leave me. And for the first time, I understood why people say the wilderness doesn't just test you, it teaches you. But only if you're willing to listen. I didn't tell anyone about the old hiker for a long time. When friends asked how my trip went, I gave the short version, how I'd gotten a little off trail, how a storm rolled through, how it turned out fine in the end. But at night, when the world was quiet and the city sounds faded, I'd think back to that ridge, that fire, that calm voice beside me in the rain. It didn't feel like just a rescue. It felt like an initiation. The kind you don't fully understand until years later. Months passed before I set foot in the backcountry again. This time I moved differently, slower, smarter. I double-checked my route, studied the terrain, and left my pride at the trailhead with the car. The forest felt less like a challenge now, and more like a conversation. One that spoke in wind shifts, bird calls, and the way sunlight filters through pine needles. Each sound meant something if you paid attention. I found myself practicing the habits he'd shown me, marking landmarks, reading clouds, listening for the tone of the woods. It was like carrying a quiet teacher beside me, even when I walked alone. One autumn evening, while hiking through the same stretch of wilderness, I stopped at that same fork in the trail. The left path, where he'd vanished into shadow, was overgrown now, almost reclaimed by brush. I stood there, boots sunk in the damp leaves, and felt a strange pull to follow it. Instead, I took off my hat, my own now, weathered and sweat-stained, and nodded toward the darkness. "Thanks," I murmured. The words barely left my lips, but the forest seemed to answer with a soft rustle, like wind through long grass. When I reached the lake again, it looked exactly as I remembered. The still water reflecting the sky, the ridges mirrored upside down. I made camp at the same spot where I'd sat, scared and parched on that first day. Only this time, I wasn't lost. I was home. As night settled in, I built a small fire, careful to leave no trace, and watched the flames dance in the breeze. Somewhere across the water, an owl called, low and steady. I smiled. The sound was familiar, almost like a greeting. I thought about what the old hiker had said. The forest gives you what you need, not what you want. Back then, I'd needed guidance. Now, I realized, I needed gratitude. Gratitude for the mistakes that humbled me, the silence that steadied me, and the stranger who'd appeared at just the right time. Maybe he was just another wanderer with a good heart. Or maybe he was something older, a spirit of the woods, keeping watch over the ones who still had something to learn. The fire burned low, embers glowing like scattered stars. I lay back on the cool ground and looked up at the real ones, 1,000 small lights flickering above the trees. The same stars he must have seen from wherever he was. And in that moment, I understood the unspoken code of the wild. The way every seasoned hiker, every quiet soul who's ever found themselves lost, carries a duty to help the next one find their way. Not for thanks, not for glory, but because that's what keeps us connected out here. The trail gives, the trail takes, and the trail remembers. When I finally drifted to sleep, I dreamed of footsteps in the pine needles, slow, sure, and fading into the endless green.